Okay, I think we're getting it working this time. That technology stuff is always flaky. Uh, I'm visiting with some folks who are doing really interesting work in the category of the notion that we all should have a web presence beyond our Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn, et cetera, page, and that it shouldn't be that difficult to do. So I'm here with Tim Owens and Jim Groom, and why don't each of you describe what you do, and then we'll jump right in.
Sure. You want to start?
Yeah, I'm obviously, well, not obviously, I'm Jim Groom, and I work and have been working for the last 10 to 15 years in higher ed, working with faculty and students to think about how the web and their presence on the web reflects and kind of integrates into the culture who we are. So I've been working pretty regularly as an instructional technologist for the last 15 years.
Okay.
And my name is Tim Owens. I was previously working at University of Mary Washington, and before that at Longwood University in Virginia. Got my start in IT and moved into instructional technology, and now I work full-time for Reclaim Hosting, the venture that Jim and I started and we're both co-founders in.
Okay. Before we talk about Reclaim, something to explain where I'm coming from for people listening, and that is that in my digital media literacy teaching, and pretty much everything I talk about to anybody, I try to tell people that we should be claiming some place on the internet that's really ours, that we really control, to the extent that such things are possible. There's always ways to lose control, even of things we think we own, but in general, I don't want people to define themselves by basically letting other people control the presentation of it. So can you talk about your commitment to this? I know you've been doing this a long time.
Sure, I'll start and feel free to jump in. It's interesting you mentioned that. Like, a lot of people, when I ask them, do you Google your name? And a lot of people do. They search on there and they're just really curious about, like, what comes up. But a lot of people do not feel like they have any control over that. And the truth is, while you may not have some control over it, your presence online actually gives you a lot of control. But when you subcede that to Facebook or to other entities, then you're really allowing them to put your face, online. And so, when I ask people, what level of control they have over it, it's like, well, I don't know. I mean, I just searched my name. I'm not too happy with what's out there. And so I tell them that the strongest presence that they can have is their own. Google has a pretty smart algorithm in that if you are running your own website, and it's attached to your name and you're putting information up about yourself, after a period of time, Google starts to see you as the authority on yourself, and they can start to figure that information out. And slowly but surely, you start to become the top result in Google search results, so that you can gain some control over what's out there. When, a lot of people think, well, if I just don't post anything online, well, then, I'm safe, right? And that's actually not the case. It's not that you won't show up in results. It's that what does show up is going to be what other people are saying about you instead of yourself. And so we think by having a presence online, you actually do gain quite a bit more control over what's being said about you, how you're being presented, and in what ways, right? Because, that's the other piece with Facebook, is sort of like, I think of this trajectory, and back when we had MySpace, people like to really play around with the backgrounds, and a lot of them looked ugly. A lot of these profiles looked really crazy. People got a little wild with these personal profiles, but they wanted some sort of control over it, and they'd sort of move stuff around, put stuff over here, change things to be like pink on top of lime green backgrounds and stuff, blink tags and flashing. And Facebook kind of sterilized all that and said, no, 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 you just tell us what books you read. You tell us what videos you like to watch and what TV shows, and we'll present all of that in a nice light blue color, and it'll all be there for you. But there's no level of customization there. You put in the information that they ask for, and then they present you in the way that fits every other container, every other person that's on there. And so you have a lot less control to really present, things in the order and in the way that you might like.
And I think, I mean, it goes to a point of, whether it be a silo in the idea of the individual distributed notion of the web as the individual as node on the web, or part of a larger kind of, encompassing body of the web, which is usually a corporate body, is a big distinction. And one of the things that I think we're very interested in, and given I think our backgrounds in education, is what you brought up earlier, Dan, is this notion of literacy, this notion of fluency, this notion of understanding how the web works and what are the kind of resources at some base level that are affordable that allow a university and a school. So at Mary Washington, Tim literally built an infrastructure that every student and every faculty member could get their own domain in web hosting and could start down that track of thinking through what it means. Now, there's questions of ownership, and they get blurry. Like, you lease a namespace, you lease a domain, you don't own it, but you do have a space online that you control and manage, and you start to, I think, as Tim said quite nicely, frame who you are online so that search engines and various kind of even people online know where to find you, some official address wherein which you live. And that's become very important, whether or not people keep it beyond their time at school, to think about, like, how do you start building out a notion of presence online, both conceptually and technically.
Right. There are two issues here that are related that we're discussing. One is a kind of home base of your own, where you define yourself, and that over time should be the first result in a search on your name, assuming you don't have a very common name and that one of the other people with that name is famous. That's another wrinkle we don't typically talk about. But the other issue, and I think that one is very important, the idea of having, to the extent possible, control of something where you define yourself as opposed to other people defining you. The other issue that we're talking about here is in that category of literacy where, in my view, in teaching the digital media and literacy in that field, I think it's clear, I don't think anyone in that field would dispute that you're not literate unless you're creating. And with the tools that we have in our hands, we can create and do create an enormous amount of stuff. And understanding how the web works and understanding how the internet works, which the web is only part of, through one's own domain and web hosting and playing around with that is actually pretty valuable. Talk about somebody who's listening to this may have no idea what web hosting is. Why don't you tell them?
Sure. So web hosting is this idea that, there are these computers that are attached to the internet, servers, and, companies basically have tons of these servers. And when you're signing up for a web hosting account, you're paying for a certain slice of a server. And it's got files on it, same as you've got files on your computer. And by virtue of it being attached to the internet, you can assign an address to it. So you can make it easier for someone to get there by typing in a URL, for example, like timowens.com. And actually I have that at timowens.io. And so when somebody types in that URL, it talks to that server and it says, show me what files he wants to display here. And it'll show those HTML files and display, an application, for example, maybe WordPress or something like that, if you've got that set up in there. And so it's really that connection that's made between a computer and the internet by making that easier. And so web hosting companies try to make that process easier by adding in things that allow you to install software on that server so that you don't necessarily have to write all of your own hand-coded HTML files anymore and things like that. But it really is just files on a server being served up to the internet and attached to an address that somebody would type in a browser in order to get there.
Files and services that one can then run from that server.
Exactly, yeah.
You mentioned WordPress, which has become, I think, for simple websites, pretty much almost the default at this point.
Yeah.
And I know that you offer that in your web hosting. What is that your view that WordPress is what people generally should use?
It really depends on what the needs are of the person. I mean, it depends a lot. So WordPress is by far the most popular open source piece of software. The fact that it's free to run, the fact that a lot of people have been using it and have sort of flexed it as a tool to accomplish a wide variety of different websites. In fact, University of Mary Washington's website, umw.edu, runs on WordPress, and that's a fairly complex site. And so we've seen really large websites make use of it as a tool. However, that complexity comes at a cost in time and resources to invest in it, where I have seen some people struggle with WordPress, honestly. There's a huge plugin architecture, but that means you've got to go out and find the plugins. There's a huge ecosystem of themes, but that requires the time and energy to go out looking for those themes. And so it's very powerful, but on that same notion, we're seeing a lot of other software start to pop up. Unfortunately, not a lot of it being offered up open source and free of charge, which is the downside. So there's a lot of proprietary systems that have become very popular. Things like Weebly, Wix is another very popular one. Squarespace, yeah, exactly.
And it's interesting too, because the moment at which we're saying, God, WordPress is complicated, like you're in a pretty good ecosystem. And Tumblr, sure, I think, did a very nice job of saying, what would a streamed down publishing system look like? And you look at Tumblr, it's like 4 icons, click, go, repost, and there's the blurring between what's yours and what's others, which I also think is interesting about Tumblr. But in terms of open source applications, Ben Verdmuller and Erin Jo Ritchie did a really nice job of kind of building on some of the stuff at Tumblr, but streaming down that sense of presence. And what I really like about what Ben and Erin have done with Known, which is the name of their application, is they've also, for me, embodied the notion of this indie web idea of Posse. Publish on your own site, but syndicate everywhere, or syndicate everywhere. And the idea is you publish on your known site or your website, and then you decide, okay, I'll push it to Twitter, I'll push it to Facebook, and it's this pushing and syndicating out to these various sources where you feel like you own the archival original, but yet you can be part of these distributed networks where people are, where people aggregate. Right. And I really like the way the Indie Web Camp or Indie Web tries to balance the idea of it's not about us going out to a cabin and locking in and being outside the social web, but it is about us being mindful of the fact that so many of these services that we've locked into either go away or change their privacy, terms of services, or just, in some ways go bad. Yeah. And at the end of the day, you really want to have a sense of what's yours and have an archive of what's yours. And I like that the indie web would be pushing to that. Yeah. One of the things the indie web has to balance also is it becomes a little bit solipsistic. It's like eat your own dog food, create your own site from scratch, which assumes a certain amount of technical prowess. Right. So I think there is that balance, but it's an interesting moment that I think we're moving into where there is some kind of mindfulness of the stuff we're doing online and have been doing online for the last decade in these social media spaces is important to our sense of identity and our notion of a legacy. And that could be a very small or very big legacy, but it's still a personal legacy. And who is going to archive that if not you, right? Like, you are your own archivist online. And I like it from the archival point of view. I mean, I am really interested in archiving my life as played out online. And that might be, I don't know if it's narcissistic or egocentric, but it's kind of like pictures you would have in a box. You do want to manage and control them because there are deep emotional memories tied to them. And I feel the same way about my online existence.
This gets into some fairly complicated and nuanced areas of what happens to things that are no longer being maintained and what happens after we're gone. And one thing we do know is that your Facebook or Twitter or Tumblr or LinkedIn, whatever the page is, your Instagram account, just pick something. It exists only as long as those companies allow it to.
Sure.
And that's and not assuming bad will on their part, but sometimes in technology, which moves quickly, things disappear and we get orphaned. So this is one reason I advocate this. You have a company that I think is quite interesting, which we mentioned at the beginning, which is Reclaim Hosting, where you do offer these services to individuals who want to go a bit more independent. And there are steps along the way. One could set up get their own domain and create a site at WordPress.com using their own name. It's $100 a year or something. It's and of course very powerful. What you do is saying to people, okay, well now you can go even further. And by the way, it's cheaper, but cost is my least consideration here. Tell us about what you do and why.
So, Jim mentioned earlier that we were doing some of this at University of Mary Washington. We had started a program to sort of give students these spaces, and it really was that we had built out sort of this web platform for Mary Washington, for students to be able to get a domain, get a space, and start to understand what that means for them. And we were talking to a lot of schools at the time who wanted to do similar things. And I even talked to faculty who would say, I would love to do this, but my school, I don't know that they're even, ready to do anything like that. And well, we found that, in education but even beyond education, really, there was a real need for a web hosting company that wasn't as focused on the business mindset of it, because what we're doing is not new by any means. If you go to GoDaddy or you go to HostGator or any number of other companies, they're doing similar things offering web hosting. But I think a lot of it is about the context and focus. And so, for us, the focus was on how do we make it as easy as possible to get up and running while still giving people the power and the tools necessary to really own their own space and experiment and play around. And we were doing that at Mary Washington when we decided that we wanted to sort of spin up something as a company that would allow others to do a similar thing. Jim had gotten a small Shuttleworth Flash grant and talked to me and said, could we just set something up really quickly, like, just out of nowhere? This was July of 2013, and he said, could we just try this for a year? He said basically, like, we would cover the cost of hosting for a year, and we'll just like have people buy the domain. And so we set up a system where for the first year we ran in a pilot, and people just paid $12 for their domain, and they got a year of hosting because we were covering that cost at the time. And really just to see, like, is there any need out of there? And we ended the year, with, I would say, almost 1,600 people on the system. And we thought, yeah, there's a need out here for sure. Absolutely. We were talking to schools that were just ecstatic to finally have this option and not to have it, mired in, this idea of constantly needing to upsell someone. And that's really the problem, even with these systems like WordPress.com. I've talked to folks who want to start publishing online, and they can't do it there because, they may be wanting to talk about things like breast cancer, and then there are ads placed on their blog posts, really dangerous ads almost sometimes. And so, like, those contextual text ads will actually lead people astray with, like, homeopathic medicine and things like that. And so the advertisement is a whole side of things. You go into some of these hosting panels, and every step of the way, they're trying to sell you something differently. We wanted to sort of strip all of that out and just say, how could we run a company that's sustainable but still offers up all of those tools, makes it affordable and easy to use? So after our first year of running a pilot, we introduced pricing, which I still think is very reasonable, but that's always been our focus, is just like focusing on, like, how do we continue to make this better and sort of build up a sort of a grassroots community. We don't spend a ton of money on marketing. We would rather spend, our time and energy and resources on talking to people, on building this up as something that's sustainable long term.
And I think one of the things that, Tim, in terms of the architect of the infrastructure, has been really an education for me, because one of the things he went out and started imagining and building is not only the, hosting, which, like he said, this is not rocket science. It's been done for a decade or more, but started to get applications like this one we use called Installatron, which allows a class or a school to install say, WordPress with a series of pre-populated themes, categories, so that you could build very slick and powerful portfolio systems.
Right.
Or if you don't want to use WordPress, you could use Mahara, you could use a whole series of other open source applications. WordPress has become the default in answer to your question, Dan, and I think because WordPress does have a very rich open source community of development, I mean, I think that's part of that ecosystem that they benefit from. But I think even more that's been interesting to me about what we're doing at Reclaim Hosting is we've also been pushing hard on the idea of, we've always done this at Mary Washington, how do we syndicate work that's happening in these isolated sites so that you can create these, GeoCities idea of communities, right? A community at Mary Washington, a community at Emory, a community at Oklahoma, a community for this class that's syndicating 30 different sites into one course hub. So we actually consult with people who come onto our hosting, and they're interested in how they use sites and blogs and wikis in effective ways to change the way in which their students own their work. They're empowered to own their work and to think about the web, but also to kind of create a distributed infrastructure like the web, right? And when you go into GoDaddy, you don't feel like you're on the web anymore, right? Like you feel like you're in an economic cage that's going to try and sell you things every step of the way. And I think one of the things we focus on is how are these tools, which have kind of been unevenly adopted to be nice by higher ed, to think about how the web has changed over the last decade, and to kind of start thinking more broadly about how things like syndication and, really change the way we can think about the digital in relationship to text, in relationship to publishing, in relationship to how we work as students and faculty more generally. And I think that's a kind of literacy that is really different, right? It's a literacy that's native to this notion of the digital that I think some of the work we're doing at Reclaim is very much focused on. Like, we're focusing on not just here's your blog, have a good day, but how are you as a faculty member or student thinking about, what's uniquely digital about the scholarship and the teaching and the learning you're doing, and what are the tools that are going to help you. And so it's a lot of resource a lot of schools don't have.
Right.
There's a focus on IT, but there's a very, very little focus on some kind of, deeply theoretical but also practically approach to how this technology is changing the way we teach.
Beyond the academy with this, a fair number of the people I'm teaching online are older and not traditional age students. Occasionally I get an email from somebody who say, I'll do my best to get this done, but I have to, take my daughter to college. That's a very interesting thing, and I think about what people will do after they're done with school, and why this is important for that as well. To, maybe this is a time to learn it, but the time to really do it and take advantage of it, especially when there's no constraints of government and privacy, student privacy, which is a whole separate thing. Sure. And why I think Reclaim is so interesting beyond schools, that people can be setting up something that, assuming you guys are around for a while, will be around for a while. But that leads to the question: how portable is the stuff we do in any hosting operation? And I've just moved all my stuff from a friend's hosting operation, because he's shutting it down, to another one, and I have an account with you now, and I'm going to do things. But how portability feels really important to me. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, I was thinking about that when we were talking about, whether it's WordPress or Node, and we were talking about that idea of archiving things. And as we think of, the various choices that we make in terms of software, this comes up as well. If you choose Squarespace, if you choose a proprietary platform in general, you're locking yourself into that platform. They might have some export tools that might allow you to extract the content of it, and not necessarily the design. And so, that's really one push for why you may want to gear yourself towards open source products, because it may be WordPress today and it might not be tomorrow. You might decide you want to switch from WordPress to Known, or you might want to, what you were using in the late 90s might not be what you use today. And that's really, I think, a really good reason to have a toolkit like this, right? To have the ability to make that choice and to make those changes and say, I want to use a different piece of software now and take all this content, change it around, do something different. Whereas you don't have that flexibility in other systems. So I think that's one key thing to it, is that we've tried, to build in open source products and tools all along the way. Your basic web server hasn't changed much in the past 20 years. You've got Apache, which is serving up the websites, and HTML is still what's used, PHP and things like that. But the software that wraps those things together and makes it simple to use, I think it's really important when you're making those decisions, because if I go to Weebly, I can't take Weebly with me. I have to use it as long as Weebly exists. But if I'm using WordPress on my own hosting system, I have all the control I need to make those decisions down the road. And maybe WordPress in 10 years will go the same way that MySpace went, in terms of whether a company exists. We have to think the same thing about software products. So that's a reason to really think about, your ability to get your content out.
Let me push this for a little further. This certainly makes sense about the proprietary systems. But moving from one host to another, if someone decides someday that where they are is not working well enough, or in your case, suppose you for whatever reason had to stop doing this, how easy or difficult would it be for your customer to move what they're doing with you to another host if it became necessary?
Yeah, we made a really strategic decision, and we had to come up with the same thing because at Mary Washington, obviously your students aren't with you forever. They're with you for 4 years. So it's sort of like, what do you decide to give your students? Do you give them a proprietary system, or do you give them some pathway to where they can move off so that they can make that decision to keep up their stuff? And that's why we ended up using cPanel. cPanel, unfortunately, is not open source. However, it is one of the most widely used hosting platforms. It's used by Bluehost, it's used by HostGator, and many of these other web hosting companies that use cPanel use it because it offers a migration path. And so that was a very calculated choice on our part right now. Obviously, we have ideas that we want to build on at Reclaim, to where we may build some sort of open source framework to build web hosting that doesn't rely on these proprietary tools. But in the short term, that absolutely was a calculated choice to use, say, what is the web industry standard? What is something that today you could give your credentials to another hosting company and they could suck in all of your stuff? We actually do the reverse for people right now, which is they want to get off of Bluehost. They want to get off of HostGator and other companies, and it's very easy to do that for the ones that are using cPanel, because I can just go in there, take a full backup, and unpack it into our system, and there's a standard there. It's a proprietary standard, but it is a standard right now. And so that was a calculated choice on our part to use what is the industry standard of the moment.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Jim.
I mean, I just think one of the things, and we think the portability question about the hosting, absolutely. The other question that's come up a lot for the last 2 years, talking with people like Ken Lane and David Wiley and other folks who work in ed tech or around ed tech, is one of the questions is, how do you port from one service to another? So I'm very interested in the idea of, so if you're in Flickr and you have images in Flickr and you're finally ready to move, would there be a service that would, or say it's Reclaim or say it's something else, that when you sign up, it's like, I want to go to a marketplace where I know I can take all my Flickr images and put them somewhere on a site, whether it's in cPanel or not, and then that can move with me. But the idea of portability on a service-by-service basis, so that when Google Reader goes down, or when Posterous goes away, or when Blip TV goes belly up, that's not an issue for you. You're not freaking out and saying, I can't believe these damn silos, we're sharecropping and we need to revolt. No, there's got to be ways in which we can start thinking about the web in a way that you can transfer your stuff seamlessly from one place to the other, based on the infrastructure, based on the specs and the details. But we want to build a marketplace where people can freely come in, take their stuff, out of one of these services and put it in another space that freely goes with them wherever they choose to host their stuff. So I like the idea of just moving the stuff you have on your cPanel, but also thinking one step abstracted from that is there ways to get the work you're doing? Because, for example, I lost my YouTube account. I had gotten called on copyright so many times, and I fought it under fair use, but they decided one day arbitrarily to say, you're done. And I backed everything up locally, but I lost all my access to that stuff with no trial, no jury, just Google decided that was that. And I think for me, that was a lesson. That even if I'm going to use YouTube or something, I want to have a backup of my stuff. I want to have it seamlessly move from site to site. I don't only want it on my computer, and I want it to follow seamlessly with me. So portability, I would say, not only about your hosting, but about every service you use, is a huge question.
And it gets even more nuanced when we, even though we can download, and Google they are very arbitrary and opaque sometimes on YouTube takedowns, and I have my issues with them, but they also have their thing they call their data liberation operation, which means you can download everything you've done. But the one thing you can't download from and Twitter also lets you download everything, and what you cannot download, though, if you decide to leave, is the conversation with other people, and no one has figured out an answer to that. I'm not asking you guys for an answer, but this is one of the things that troubles me a lot.
Well, I think one thing that has a lot of promise is just it feels like we're in a moment where the idea of the API is really popular. The idea that when you put a service out there, that you also open it up to the ability to interoperate with other services has never been more popular than it is today. And that's really promising because it does start to allow developers to take advantage of that. And we see services like If This Then That that are starting to allow that kind of interoperability. Right. It still feels very difficult. It still feels a lot like there's a lot of recipes out there and people are doing things in different ways, but nobody's started to found those easier ways to do it. So I think there's still a lot of opportunity for developers to take advantage of that. But before it was like, services had no incentive to even make their service available externally, to developers. And now there's been a real push for that. And so that, at least, I think, is a promising development. You mentioned the Twitter backup, and I actually made use of a script that Martin Hawksey, one of our users, wrote for Twitter. And so I actually have my Twitter backup inside of Google Drive, and this script regularly grabs the newer Twitter updates and puts them into that same backup. So I can go to twitter.timowens.io, and it's the latest copy of my Twitter account, searchable, and everything's in there, and I don't have to do anything. And I know if Twitter ever went away, I'd have that copy, and I could do something with that, as opposed to just this static archive. And so I'm really hopeful that in the next few years, more developers are going to take advantage of stuff like that that's out there, and that they're able to make use of.
It's a big area. I don't want to hold you guys, and students have limited attention spans for these videos, so I'm going to, everybody has limited attention spans.
Right. That's right.
It's not on them, it's on us. Last question. In my course next week, one of the assignments is to get the domain name. And you guys offer a domain name and hosting for $25 a year. Is that the correct amount? That's an amazingly great bargain, and I will certainly mention it. If you didn't exist as a web host company, who would you tell people to go to?
Good question.
Good question. Let's see if we match up. You go first, and I'll see if I agree or disagree.
Well, I'll be honest. I'd probably say buy your domain names maybe from Hover. And then in terms of hosting, I've only used independent hostings. Okay. So I've never used any. I mean, I used the Bluehost once as a kind of work professional thing that I was playing with that was paid for by someone else. But I would frankly probably stay away from the big ones. I mean, maybe HostGator. I mean, they seem to be, but I would stay away from the big ones. I would look for a smaller one that was willing to work with you.
Okay, and Tim?
Yeah, hover.com for domains, definitely. It's one that I really like, although I hear a lot of people really like Namecheap as well. And so I hear those two come up as probably the two large ones in terms of domain registrars. And then, yeah, for web hosting, obviously if cost is your concern, then the bottom of the barrel is going to be sort of something like HostGator or Bluehost. But I think that cost comes with, being marketed to regularly. So again, I go back to the same idea of what are you trying to accomplish? Is it a WordPress site, and does it make sense to get your domain and start with WordPress.com? And that be sort of your hosting service. If you want a full-on hosting account, then yeah, something a bit more independent. I'm trying to think. I can't think of.
Well, Media Temple. I mean,
Media
you could
Temple.
argue
Media Temple is owned by GoDaddy now, so I'm not sure that I
okay.
would still recommend it like we did.
Again, I agree with you totally on Hover, since the people who run it are friends, but and they're a great service. But on the sort of boutique hosting, the independent hosting, there is the other issue which I'm just confronting, which is my friend who's been running a boutique hosting operation and giving me wonderful service decided he needed to spend more time with his family, and that was that. So there are trade-offs however we go in all these things, and we all face them every day. I think
that underlines a lot of it, right? There are trade-offs to just about every decision that folks will make in regards to the software they use, the host that they use, where they buy their things, and that kind of stuff as well. So you're absolutely right.
I want to thank both of you for joining me today, and I'll probably use more excerpts than the full thing, but maybe I'll just post the whole thing and leave it at that. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your taking the time.
You're welcome. Thanks for talking with us.
Thank you, Dan.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.